Chest up, shoulders back. This is Revival Fitness, your home for gains and brains. A lot of you guys, as summer is here, and even if you see this later, everybody's going to want to cut eventually, and the biggest question that comes with cutting is, how do you keep the most muscle? And I'm going to share with you all of these strategies that I have used, both in and out of the gym, to do so. But in any case, if you do cut this drastically, a lot's going to happen. And I want to make that one note before we get started, guys. Do not conflate the cut that I'm on right now, or even if you want to go on a serious cut similar to me. These things are not remotely the same as going from, say, the low 20% body fats down to 15. The reality of the situation is that a lot of you guys with aspirations to get shredded, you've never been below 15% body fat in your life. I learned this the hard way during my first prep. It is an entirely different ballgame trying to cut down to the low teens, say 12%-ish, as opposed to getting legitimately shredded. I would call the 12% range lean, but getting below 10% and even deeper and deeper into that, that's what qualifies as actually being shredded, or ripped, or peeled. But there is a stark difference between the two, and with each body fat percentage that you go down, the more and more that these get pronounced. So as you watch this video, if you are doing a general cut, just getting down to the mid-teens or so, you don't have to mimic everything I say here or just totally change your training routine outright to match it. But the deeper into a cut that you go, I think the more that these methods become viable and ultimately necessary. And this is a harsh truth as well, but most of you are holding much more body fat than you realize.
He's fat!
That's another topic, we'll talk about that in a coming video, but that is something that you are probably going to learn the hard way once you decide to do a major cut. So the training methods that we're going to cover here fall under the umbrella of auto-regulation. That basically means adjusting your training variables as you receive real-time feedback from your body. Now, of course, if your training program in general is not good, which a lot of you guys are in that circumstance right now, you can check out my programs down below, novice and intermediate ones available. But getting your overall training taken care of is essential to maximizing the process whether you're bulking or cutting. And if you're on a serious cut getting down to really low body fat, believe me, your body is going to give you plenty of this feedback. So in the pursuit of losing as much body fat as possible, we want to keep cortisol, the stress hormone, as under control as we can. Chronically elevated cortisol is going to stop your body from losing fat, even if you are in a deficit. It also can negatively impact your sleep, which in turn limits any potential muscle growth, and makes it that much harder to keep the muscle that you've already built. So if you're not careful with these variables, your body's going to be releasing more cortisol than Kendrick and Drake release diss tracks. And on the topic of stress and fatigue, probably the most popular way among everybody, not just lifters, to try and beat their own fatigue is by consuming caffeine. In the gym context, this means snorting lines of pre-workout every time you go to the gym. I gotta have my 2 scoops, bro, to get my energy and get my pump. This is basically putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. I've talked to plenty of people, I'm sure you know them too, you may be one. They essentially have withdrawal symptoms if they don't get their daily caffeine fix. I mean, most people need a constant stream of caffeine every day of their life to simply function. Coffee in the morning, energy drink in the afternoon, pre-workout before the gym, and then y'all are surprised that you can't sleep. So I know this is easier said than done, especially if you have to wake up early and other life circumstances, but I would work on coming off of the caffeine as much as you can. If you happen to not have it one day, and you get to the gym, or even less of it than you're used to, and you plateau or regress, your energy's not good, that's only going to make you more likely the next time to take even more caffeine. You have to keep bumping and bumping it up. It's just not ideal if you ask me. If nothing else, I would at least try to come off all of these sugary energy drinks. And that goes on to the topic of diet overall. That's one of the big reasons a lot of you lack energy in the first place, so please do not skimp on, or God forbid totally eliminate, dietary fat. The caloric density of fat tends to scare people, and especially in the context of a lot of modern fitness dieting, so-called volume eating, people want to eat as much as possible on their cuts, which I understand in principle, but also understand, if you are not getting sufficient dietary fat, which also has a major impact on your hormones and your recovery, the amount of calories that you're saving from minimizing the fat, they don't really amount to much. I've talked to a lot of people, men and women both, who have done the very low-fat diets when cutting, and across the board, it is essentially the same symptoms. Energy goes to shit, your libido tanks, you have more trouble sleeping, your overall focus and brain fog, they get pretty bad. And by the way, the deeper into a cut that you go, all of these are going to eventually happen to some degree, but these side effects should not be occurring, I would say, until around the 10% body fat mark for men. If you're getting these side effects sooner than roughly that point, that is a diet problem more than anything else. And one more note before we go into the training variables themselves regarding the timeline of cutting. So let's say, for example, you are doing a standard, let's just call it 16-week cut, just for the sake of argument. It will typically go like this. Near the start of the cut, you can probably still gain a little bit of muscle mass if you started from a reasonable body fat. Now, if you started at 12%, shredding down to 6, this is probably not going to happen, but that is not going to be most of your circumstances. Then toward the middle, muscle gain is going to become very sparse. Realistically, probably nothing tangible. Even if you manage to squeak out a PR here and there, the amount of muscle you're going to gain at this point is very negligible. Now, that said, it is easy to think that you are getting bigger, when really you just appear that way because you're getting leaner. But most of your efforts in this phase are going to be just maintaining what you already have to the fullest extent, and then by the end of the cut, you could say the final 4 to 6 weeks, maybe give or take a bit more or less depending on how severely you cut down, you are likely losing some degree of muscle. At this point, you are desperately clinging to whatever you can. Now, even if you can't tell that you're losing the muscle because of the leanness illusion, your gym performance is going to make that clear. You probably have plateaued on numerous things, if not outright regressed. And by the way, this is normal. Don't freak out. Once you end your cut, those muscles are going to come back pretty damn quickly due to muscle memory, and your strength is eventually going to come back as well. You need to understand the phases of dieting and stay in your lane in accordance with your goal. As the famous economist Thomas Sowell told us years ago, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And your primary goal during a cut, if you're taking it as far as possible, is to get as lean as possible. And the trade-off of that is muscle. It is going to stagnate for a while, and you may even lose a little bit, but that is the price you have to pay if you want to get the abs that you so desperately want. And also note that if you're doing one of the more moderate cuts, as I described earlier, you're only going down to the mid-teens, maybe slightly below that in terms of body fat, you really shouldn't be losing any muscle mass at all. So keep all of this in mind as we go into with these training strategies, the first one being reducing volume. And I know this terrifies a lot of you who've been indoctrinated by the church of guys who never leave the gym, but you need to hear me out. With each passing set you do, the more exponentially fatigue increases in relation to the potential growth that the set can stimulate. So on a serious cut, your fatigue is already facing an uphill battle from the lower food, and likely the added cardio as well. And junk volume is a big problem for a lot of guys in general. And you combine junk volume with the cut for a prolonged period, you're gonna be in the mud, bro. And by the way, quick note for the bros here, I know if you're on a cut and you're starting to look leaner, you know, you see yourself in the mirror, you got your pump, you look all good under the lighting, and you should be finished with your workout, but then you see her. Your gym crush. And instead of leaving, you're going to prolong your workout and always kind of hover in her vicinity. You're sitting there flexing in the mirror, looking out of the corner of your eye, hoping that she notices you. Look, dude, if you're gonna talk to her, then just go talk to her. If not, then go home. But the first way to reduce volume is by decreasing sets. And I think this is best done on the biggest and heaviest lifts, at least as a baseline measure. So on this cut now, I'm down to 2 sets for a lot of exercises when I typically would do 3. And sometimes I just do 1 hard set if I'm very tired. At this point in my training, guys, I basically never go above 3 sets for anything, even the isolation movements, but even reducing a single set can have noticeable benefits for your fatigue. So here's an example. Let's say you are scheduled to do 3 sets. The first one is rough, but it's manageable. Now set 2 was noticeably harder. You ever have that scenario whenever the weight just feels heavier? You can't really quantify it, but maybe you're shaking while holding the weight, unracking it was very tough, especially if you have a rep drop off too, that is noticeable. So for example, let's say you're working in the 6 to 8 rep range on this exercise. The first set, you get 8 reps. Nice. The second set, you only get 5 reps, or maybe you barely squeak out the 6, but the last rep, no matter how many it was a total grinder. It was very, very difficult. So not only is there a noticeable drop-off in the reps, but especially if you've fallen outside of the target rep range on that lift, that is a sign to pack it up. Set number 3, I would just skip it. Live to fight another day, and if this becomes a consistent trend, I think you're better off having 2 sets as your baseline going forward, as opposed to 3. And that goes on to the second method of reducing volume. You can simply remove an exercise entirely. And I usually would not go for this method as a first measure, but the deeper into a cut that you go, and really if your overall programming is just too much, it is definitely viable. There are 2 main criteria. The first are going to be exercises that are simply redundant. What that really boils down to is they hit a muscle group or a movement pattern that you've already taken care of on a given day. I see this type of thing all the time when guys ask me to review their programs. So let's say it's a push day or upper body day. They will have bench press, incline bench press, dumbbell bench press, some other chest exercise. Notice that you've already hit the same movement with the barbell bench press earlier. So at this point, it makes more sense to simply ditch the dumbbell bench, or if you prefer that over the barbell, you can do that instead, but there's really no need to be doing both when your fatigue is at a premium. And the second criteria here are exercises that you have plateaued, if not outright regressed on. And keep in mind, the deeper into a deficit that you go, the more inevitable this becomes. So for instance, on my cut now, I have been miserably plateaued on hamstring curls, both the lying and seated and even kneeling versions for, well, it's been months now. I think I might have squeaked out a rep PR or 2 over the past couple of months, but otherwise, I've gone basically nowhere on hamstring isolations. Now that said, I have been able to hit some PRs on my bigger hamstring-involved movements, such as the Romanian deadlifts, that I will typically start my lower body days with. But these bigger movements cook me pretty hard, and by the time I get to the hamstring isolation after, I've basically got nothing left. So after a certain point, it just makes more sense to remove the hamstring curls. If not at least, as mentioned earlier, reduce some of the sets. Now keep in mind, if they were a weak point, I could replace the RDLs with the hamstring curls, which would make more sense. So this is ultimately a matter of circumstance. I know some of you guys will have questions about your own programming. Understand, I cannot properly answer you and diagnose these things over the comment section alone. If you guys would like to get in direct contact with me, the best way is on the Patreon, and you're also going to get lifetime Discord server access there. But I like to reduce volume as the first measure of defense, you could call it, during a cut, but that is not the only way. From there, you also may consider the second major training variable, which is reducing intensity. Now, the one big thing you have to note about intensity is that it is individual perception. You have to judge and estimate it on your own, unless you have a coach. But my metric of measuring intensity is RIR, or reps in reserve. You've likely also heard the term RPE, which means rate of perceived exertion, and they're essentially just mirrors of each other, and they are inverse. So 0 reps in reserve implies that you could not do a single other rep even if you tried, and that equates to 10 rate of perceived exertion, meaning you lifted at your maximum effort. 1 RIR equals 9 RPE, 2 RIR equals 8 RPE, and then you can follow that same math down the line. Using either one of these intelligently is much better than being the commercial gym schmuck who ends the set as soon as you start to feel the burn. Make no mistake, you still need to train hard when you're cutting to maintain as much muscle as possible, and maybe even grow the little bit that you can. But you don't need to be hitting absolute failure on everything. I would not use a training partner in terms of assisted reps, and force negatives, and Mike Menser maxing, all these other methods. Really, even in a bulking phase, this is just unnecessary. But when it comes to a cut, it's going to be totally detrimental. So when it comes to the exercises that overall are not terribly fatiguing, this includes lighter machines like the leg extension, you could say the pec deck, something like curls, as well as ab work. Failure is not really that much of an issue. I think you could still go to 0 RIR for these, and it's not going to be a big deal. But when it comes to the biggest and heaviest compound movements, that can be a different story. For the machines, you might have a bit more leeway here since you're able to fail them safely if it comes to that, such as a leg press versus a typical back squat. but I would still not intentionally go past 1 RIR on the big lifts as a general rule. And I'll have to keep repeating this, guys, because it takes time to really internalize, but yes, you are going to plateau and eventually regress on certain lifts the more that you cut. I know the truth hurts, but you're not going to get shredded abs and keep your bench press exactly the same, let alone make progress on it, unless you're willing to take tren. And if you do get to the point on your cut to where you're just completely exhausted, you are really not looking forward to training, your sleep is suffering, you're just completely dragging along, you probably at that point will benefit from a deload, whether that is brief for only a few days or an entire week. You can also reduce your volume on a deload, but this can also come down to localized pain too. So if your biceps, for example, are really sore, maybe you're getting tennis elbow tendonitis in that area, you may really benefit from reducing the intensity on the curls, or just completely skipping them for that given week, then working on coming back stronger after the fact. So we've talked about auto-regulating volume and intensity. Now it's time to talk about the third end of that triangle, the frequency. And this one has the PPL bras shaking in their boots. But really, PPL is actually a great example here, because it can very easily have the frequency reduced by switching from a 6-day split down to a 3-day split. So that is one way to reduce the frequency. You can go from hitting a muscle group 2 times a week down to 1. I would generally recommend hitting a muscle group twice a week as a baseline. I don't think there is a massive advantage to training 2 times a week for a given muscle group. I do think there is an advantage, given a number of factors. You can click the video in the top corner for more information on that. But even if you don't formally drop the frequency like I just mentioned, you could include more rest days or add a singular one between the current days on your split. So for example, rather than the typical 6-day push-pull legs where you do push, pull, legs, rest, then repeat, it would become push, rest, pull, rest, legs, rest, and then you repeat that cycle. And you could also divvy that up however you'd like. You could do, say, push and pull, then rest, then legs, then repeat. This is kind of individual, but there's a lot of ways that you can do it. In the same token, if you're doing a 4-day upper-lower, you could take 2 rest days between the first block of the week, and then where you normally would take 2 rest days after the second block, you could even increase those to 3 going into the following week. As I mentioned earlier, guys, doing a basic general cut is not going to warrant making such changes like this, but this can encourage you to take an overall look at your split and make modifications based on that, because as I said earlier, a lot of you guys are trying to do high volume and intensity and frequency all at the same time, if not just general junk volume, too much of that. You're holding yourself back from gains, even in a bulking phase, because of these errors. So take this into account, no matter what phase that you're in. So we've knocked out volume, intensity, and frequency, but there's one more major component of the exercise selection that you're doing that comes into play here, and that is axial loading. If you don't know, axial loading refers to lifts in which the back has no external support against the weight, therefore compressing the spine, and these tend to be the hardest on the back overall, but especially the low back. And these are not inherently unsafe, but they do carry a very high fatigue demand comparatively. The most intense ones are going to be squats and deadlifts. Overhead press and rows, I would say less so, but those are kind of the big 4. You could also throw in a good morning into that mix as well. And this is especially true if you're doing multiple axial loading movements on the same day. So I don't think you should remove them outright from your routine just because you're cutting. So I would utilize the strategies mentioned earlier first. I would reduce volume, mainly the sets on some of these, if that is applicable. You also could remove them or skip them, as talked about. That said, if that is becoming a habit, that's not good, and you and I both know that no guy is ever going to pass up a good excuse to skip legs, especially squatting. Oh, I'm kind of fatigued, bro, not gonna squat. That's pretty much going to keep happening indefinitely. He may never squat again. So if axial loading is giving you a lot of problems at the current point, you are better suited to find replacements. So for example, instead of Romanian deadlifts, I have been focusing more on the hyperextension while holding an easy bar. So the same muscles are being hit here, it is still a hip hinge, but much less overall weight is used, and my body is supported by the pad, ergo it is not as stressful on the low back, as well as the entire body itself. And I also believe that the dumbbell version of Romanian deadlifts are easier to recover from as well. Also consider, instead of freestanding barbell or dumbbell rows, you can do them on a chest-supported machine or a seated cable row. So we can keep going down this list, but axial loading is another component of your training that you want to proactively manage, and you're going to have to react to real-time feedback from your body to not only get the most out of these exercises, but make sure that they don't bury you more than they need to. But this has been it for me, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to drop a like and share this video if you found it helpful. If you want to get in direct contact with me, the best way to do so is on the Patreon. You can check out my programs down below as well, make more gains in less time, and shock your past self, do what you thought used to not be possible, and use my links to save money on some great products and services. And I will catch you guys next time.